She said it the way people say things they have been rehearsing, sitting across from me at my kitchen table, the one Edward and I had bought at the furniture store on Route 9 in 1991 for $240 because we had just moved into the house and we needed something to eat at, and $240 was a careful decision that year, the way every decision was a careful decision that year, because careful decisions were how you built something when you were starting from almost nothing. My daughter-in-law Renata was 38 years old. She had the particular composed energy of a woman who had decided something and who was delivering the decision rather than discussing it. She set her coffee down. She folded her hands. She said, "Ruth, Thomas and I have been talking about the future, about what makes sense for everyone going forward." I said, "What does everyone include, Renata?" She said, "Well, obviously you, and Thomas, and the children, my grandchildren. Lily, who was 7, and who had my mother's eyes, and who called me Grandma Ruth, and who had been calling me Grandma Ruth since she learned to say the word grandma, and whose voice on the phone on Sunday afternoons was the particular sound that made every other sound in the week worth getting through. And Marcus, who was 4, and who still fit on my lap, and who smelled like outside, and who fell asleep in the car on the way home from my house every Sunday, without fail, and who Thomas told me about on Monday mornings, with the particular warmth that fathers have when they describe their sleeping children. She said we think it would be best if the visits were paused for a while. I said paused. She said just temporarily, until some things are resolved. I said, "What things, Renata?" She looked at her hands. She looked at her coffee. She said, "Ruth, you have a significant retirement fund." She said it the way you say something you have been told to say by someone who has coached the saying of it, clean, direct, the particular language of a person who has decided that the polite approach has not produced results and that clarity is now the only remaining option. She said Thomas and I are in a position where some financial support would make a real difference. She said if you were willing to transfer the retirement fund into a joint account that Thomas had access to, it would allow us to invest in some opportunities that we believe would benefit the whole family. Benefit the whole family. I said, "Renata, you are telling me that I cannot see my grandchildren unless I sign over my retirement fund to Thomas." She said I would not phrase it that way. I said, "How would you phrase it?" She said I would say that resolving the financial situation would remove some of the tension that is making the current arrangement difficult. I looked at this woman, 38 years old, sitting at my kitchen table using words that were designed to make a transparent thing sound complex. The arrangement, the tension, the opportunities that would benefit the whole family. Language shaped around a simple ugly center, the way certain fruit has beautiful skin and something else inside. I had known this was coming, not the exact words, not the exact morning, but I had known. The way you know certain things when you have been paying attention for long enough, and when the pattern has been forming slowly enough that each individual piece seems small, and the accumulation reveals itself only when you step back and look at the whole. I had been stepping back and looking at the whole for 8 months. I had seen Renata's influence in Thomas changing, in the particular way he talked about money, in the comments about the house being too large for one person, in the questions about the retirement fund that had started as casual and become specific. How much is in it exactly? What would it take to access it? Have you thought about what you are going to do with it eventually? Eventually. Said by a 34-year-old man about his 72-year-old mother's retirement fund, the way you say, eventually, when you mean sooner. I had called my attorney 8 months ago. Her name was Patricia Chen, and she had been my attorney since Edward died in 2019, and who had helped me execute Edward's estate with the particular thorough care that Edward's estate required, because Edward had been a thorough, careful man who had built thorough, careful protections, and who had asked Patricia specifically to help me understand and maintain those protections after he was gone. I had called Patricia, and I had told her what I was observing, the questions about the fund, the comments about the house, the particular direction of Thomas's interest in his mother's finances that had shifted from son's concern to something with a different quality. Patricia had listened. She had said, "Ruth, I think it is time to show you something." She said Edward left something in the trust documents that we have not needed to discuss until now. She said, "I think now is the time." I had gone to her office. She had opened the file. She had shown me the document. I had read it. And I had understood for the first time in the 3 years since Edward died that even gone, he was still taking care of me, the way he had always taken care of me, quietly, thoroughly, with the particular love of a man who planned for the worst, because planning for the worst was how you protected the person you loved most from it. I looked at Renata across my kitchen table. I said, "Renata, I want to show you something." She said, "Ruth, I really think we should focus on—" I stood up. I went to the drawer beside the stove, the drawer where I kept the things that mattered. The document had been there for 8 months since Patricia gave me a copy and told me to keep it somewhere accessible. She had said, "You are going to need to put your hands on it quickly someday." Today was someday. I took out the folder. I came back to the table. I sat down. I set the folder on the table between us. I said, "Renata, my husband Edward passed away in 2019. Before he died, he worked with our attorney to establish a family trust. In 1998, 26 years ago, when Thomas was 10 years old. I said Edward was a man who planned carefully, who thought about the future the way certain people think about the future. Not with anxiety, with precision. He looked at what he had built, and he thought about every direction from which it could be threatened, and he wrote protections for each direction into the trust document. She was looking at the folder. I said, "One of those protections is in this folder. Now let me tell you about Edward, because you need to understand Edward to understand the document, because the document is Edward. Every clause of it is Edward, the precise, careful, thoughtful man who built things slowly and well, and who never once in 43 years of marriage did anything halfway. Edward Calloway had been a civil engineer. He had spent 38 years designing infrastructure, bridges, roads, water systems, the particular invisible architecture that allows cities to function and that nobody thinks about until it fails. He had brought the same approach to his family. He designed for load, for stress, for the specific forces that would be applied over time. He accounted for the things most people did not think to account for. In 1998, Thomas was 10 years old, and Edward came home from a week of continuing education in Columbus and sat at the kitchen table after dinner and said, "Ruth, I want to talk to you about the trust." I said, "Edward, Thomas is 10. We are 46 years old. The trust can wait," he said. "The trust cannot wait." He said, "I have been thinking about something." He said, "I love Thomas, but I have been watching him and I want to tell you something I have observed." He said, "Thomas is a good boy, kind, smart." He said, "But Thomas is going to be the kind of man who is influenced by the people he chooses to love, who takes the shape of the relationship he is in." He said, "I do not know who Thomas is going to marry Ruth. I do not know what that person will be like. And I want to make sure that whoever that person is, they cannot use Thomas against you." I had said, "Edward, you are planning 30 years ahead for a problem that may not exist." He said, "Ruth, a bridge that holds the load it was designed for is not evidence that the design was unnecessary. It is evidence that the design worked." He said, "I would rather design for a load that never comes than fail to design for one that does." He had called Patricia Chen the next week. He had spent 2 months working with her on the additional clauses. He had been specific. He had been thorough. He had written what he wanted in plain language, and Patricia had translated it into the legal form that made it binding, and he had signed it, and Patricia had filed it, and it had been sitting in a county courthouse file for 26 years, waiting for the load it was designed for. The load had arrived. Her name was Renata. I opened the folder. I said, "I am going to read you 3 clauses from the family trust established by Edward Calloway in 1998. I said, "Listen carefully, Renata, because these clauses are going to change your morning." She looked at the document, something moving across her face, the particular expression of a person who is seeing something they were not expecting and who is calculating rapidly what it means. Clause 1. I said the document reads, "No beneficiary of this trust, including Thomas Edward Calloway, may receive any distribution from trust assets or exert any influence over the primary beneficiaries, that is me, use or management of trust-protected assets, including the primary residence and the retirement accounts, if that beneficiary is found to have engaged in coercive conduct toward the primary beneficiary." Coercive conduct is defined as any action or communication designed to compel the primary beneficiary to transfer, relinquish, or diminish her control over protected assets through the use of threats, conditions, or the restriction of access to family members, including, but not limited to, grandchildren. I looked up from the document. I said, Renata, the condition you delivered this morning, sign the retirement fund over to Thomas, or you cannot see Lily and Marcus, is the exact conduct this clause defines as coercive, word for word. The clause was written in 1998. Edward did not know your name. He did not know what you would look like, or where you would come from, or how you would sit at this table with your hands folded, but he knew the shape of what you would do, and he wrote the response to it 26 years before you did it. Renata said, that clause cannot be enforceable. She said it in the voice of a woman who is not certain the thing she is saying is true, but who needs it to be true. I said, Patricia Chen filed this trust with the county in 1998, Renata. It has been active for 26 years. Patricia reviewed it 8 months ago and confirmed that every clause remains fully enforceable. I have a letter from her in this folder confirming that opinion if you would like to see it. I turned to the second clause. Clause 2. I said the document reads, the primary residence at 44 Sycamore Drive is held in trust for the lifetime use of Ruth Eleanor Calloway. Upon evidence of coercive conduct as defined above by any beneficiary, or their spouse or domestic partner, the trust shall have the automatic right to initiate proceedings to recover any trust property currently occupied or used by that beneficiary or their spouse or domestic partner. I set the page down. I said, Renata, the house you and Thomas live in on Meridian Street. I said that house was purchased using trust funds 7 years ago. It was purchased in the trust's name because that was how Edward structured the family's property. Thomas has use of the house. He does not own it. The trust owns it, and the trust has the right to initiate recovery proceedings when a beneficiary engages in coercive conduct toward me. She said, what does recovery proceedings mean? I said it means the trust can move to have the property vacated. She said vacated. I said it means an eviction notice, Renata, a formal legal notice requiring you and Thomas to vacate a property that belongs to the trust and that the trust is reclaiming because the beneficiary living in it has engaged in coercive conduct toward the primary beneficiary. The color in her face had changed. I said Patricia filed the initial paperwork yesterday afternoon. I said the notice will be delivered to your door today. I said before you say anything I want to be clear that the notice does not mean you are being immediately removed from the house. It means the process has started. Thomas can contest it. He can come to me. We can talk. The process can be stopped if the conduct stops and if what happened this morning is addressed. She said you filed this yesterday. I said I called Patricia 8 months ago, Renata, when the questions about the retirement fund started having a different quality. I said the paperwork has been ready for 6 months. I was waiting to use it. I told Patricia the morning before this conversation to file the initial notice because I knew what this morning was going to look like. She said, how did you know? I said because Edward knew. 26 years ago, he sat at this kitchen table and told me that the people we love are sometimes influenced by the people they love and that the protection needed to exist, regardless of whether it was ever needed. I said Edward was an engineer, Renata. He designed for loads. He designed this trust for the load that arrived this morning. She was very quiet. I turned to the third clause. I said there is one more. Clause 3. I said the document reads, the retirement accounts established in the name of Ruth Eleanor Calloway are trust-protected assets. They may not be transferred, assigned, or diminished in any way at the direction or request of any beneficiary or their spouse or domestic partner. Any document purporting to authorize such a transfer that is signed under conditions of coercion as defined above shall be considered void and unenforceable, regardless of the form of the signing. I said Edward wrote this clause because he understood something about me. I said he knew that I loved Thomas. He knew that my love for Thomas and my love for his children could be used as a lever, that someone could press on that love to move me towards something I would not otherwise do. He wrote this clause not because he thought I was weak, because he knew I was a mother, and he understood that mothers can be moved through their children in ways that nothing else can move them. I said he was right about that, Renata. I would do a great deal for my grandchildren, a very great deal. But I will not empty my retirement fund to fund investment opportunities for a son who is asking me to choose between my financial security and my family. Because that choice is not a choice between two things. It is a trap. And Edward saw it 26 years ago and built the door out of it. She said, Ruth. I said yes. She said, Thomas does not know I was coming here today. I looked at her. I said, Renata. She said, he does not know. He does not know what I was going to say. He knows I was coming to visit. He does not know about the retirement fund. The conversation. He does not know I was going to. She stopped. I looked at this woman, 38 years old, the color gone from her face. The composed energy dismantled the way a composed thing dismantles when the composure is revealed to have been covering something that could not hold under examination. I said, Renata, I am going to ask you a question. I need you to answer it honestly. She said, all right. I said, does Thomas know you were coming here today to tell me I could not see my grandchildren unless I signed over the retirement fund? She looked at the table. She said, no. I said, does Thomas know about the Meridian Street house, that it belongs to the trust, that he does not own it? She said, no. I said, does Thomas know about any of this? She said, he knows about the retirement fund. She said, he mentioned once that you had a significant amount saved and she stopped. I said, you took that information and built a plan around it without telling him the full plan. She said, we have financial pressures, Ruth, real ones, the business, the children's school. We are stretched, and I saw an opportunity and I said you thought a 72-year-old woman who loves her grandchildren could be moved. She said yes. I looked at my daughter-in-law, not with the anger that would have been easy, with the particular clear vision that arrives when a complicated thing resolves into its actual shape and you can see it for the first time without the language wrapped around it. She was not a monster, she was a woman under financial pressure who had made a calculating decision without understanding what she was walking into. Without knowing that the woman at the kitchen table had been sitting with a document for 8 months. Without knowing that the man who designed this trust had spent 2 months with an attorney in 1998 thinking about exactly this. She was a woman who had looked at a 72-year-old widow and seen someone manageable. She had been wrong about that, but I understood how she arrived at the conclusion. I said, Renata, I am going to tell you what happens next. She looked at me. I said, I am going to call Patricia today. I am going to ask her to pause the eviction proceedings, not cancel, pause. The proceedings stop while Thomas and I talk. And Thomas and I are going to talk, not about the retirement fund, about what has been happening in your household that has produced this much financial pressure, about whether there are things I can do that are within what I am willing to do. Help that does not require me to empty my financial security into an account I do not control. I said I am capable of helping my son Renata. I have helped my son his entire life. That has not changed. What has changed is the method of the ask. You cannot use my grandchildren as leverage to move me. That is the one thing I will not absorb. She said, I understand. I said, I do not think you do yet. I said, I think you will understand when you sit across from Thomas tonight and tell him what happened this morning. I said, I think you will understand it fully in that conversation. She looked at the table. I said, Renata, my husband wrote this trust document in 1998 because he loved me. Not because he was suspicious or fearful or negative about the future, because he was an engineer, and engineers design for load, and he loved me enough to spend 2 months of his evenings working with an attorney to make sure that every load I might ever face had a designed response. I said, that is who Edward was. Renata, that is where the document comes from. Not from suspicion, from love. I said the document has held for 26 years without being needed. This morning it was needed, and it held, because Edward built things that held. She said, Ruth, I am sorry. I looked at her. She said, I am genuinely sorry. I said what I said, and I meant to use it as leverage, and I was wrong. She said the children should see you. Lily asks about you every week. Marcus calls you in his sleep. She said Thomas talks about you the way. She stopped. She said the way people talk about someone who is the foundation of something. Without always knowing that is what they are doing, just always turning toward you. I set my hand on the folder. I said, call Thomas. Tell him to come here tonight. Tell him everything. I said, do not tell him a version of it. Everything. She said he is going to be angry with me. I said, yes, he is. She said, and the house. The eviction. I said, I told you. Paused. While we talk. I said, Thomas and I have talked through hard things before, Renata. We will talk through this one. That is what families do when they are actually being families rather than arrangements. She looked at me. Something in her face that had not been there when she walked in. Something that was not composed and was not performing. Something that was just a woman sitting at a kitchen table who had come in carrying a plan and who was leaving carrying something heavier and more honest. She said, Ruth, can I ask you something? I said, yes. She said, the trust, the clauses. Did you read them before this morning? I mean, really read them. Did you know all of this was in there? I said, Patricia showed me the document 8 months ago. I read every word. I read it 3 times. She said, and before that? Before 8 months ago? I said, no. I knew the trust existed. Edward had told me he had established protections. He did not go through every clause with me. He said, Ruth, if you ever need it, Patricia will walk you through it. He said, you are going to be all right. She said, he told you that. I said, the last year of his life he told me that many times. He would say it at the end of conversations about the future, about what happens after, about how I was going to manage. He would say all of it, and then at the end he would say, you are going to be all right, Ruth. I made sure of it. She said he made sure of it in 1998. I said Edward made sure of everything, early Renata. That was who he was. He did not wait for the bridge to fail before reinforcing it. He designed it to hold. She left 20 minutes later, quietly, without the composed energy she had carried in, with something different, the particular quality of a person who has arrived at a place they did not expect to arrive at, and who is going to need some time to understand where they are. Thomas called at 3 in the afternoon. His voice was the voice of a man who has just learned something about his morning that he was not part of, and that has rearranged several things simultaneously. He said, Mom. I said, hello, Thomas. He said, Mom. Renata told me everything. I said, I know she did. He said, Mom. I did not know she was going to say that to you. About the fund. About the kids. I did not know. I said, I know, Thomas. I know you did not. He said I would never. Mom, I would never use Lily and Marcus like that. I said, I know, sweetheart. He said, I am so sorry. I said, Thomas, I want you to hear something. The eviction proceedings have been paused. They will remain paused as long as we are talking. As long as you and I are actually talking the way a son and a mother talk when something difficult is true between them. He said, we are talking, Mom. I am here. I am talking. I said, good. Then I said, Thomas, tell me about the financial pressure, the real version, not the version where an opportunity exists and the retirement fund would help, the real version. What is happening? And he told me. He told me for 40 minutes about the business contracts that had fallen through, about the debt that had accumulated in the gap, about the particular specific weight of a man who has been trying to keep something from sinking and who has been doing it alone because telling his mother meant admitting that the independence he had been performing was less solid than it appeared. I listened. I said, Thomas, when you were finished, I said, thank you for telling me. I said, I cannot give you the retirement fund. I want to be clear about that. Not because of the trust document, because the retirement fund is what I live on. It is what keeps me in the house and in my life, and able to be Grandma Ruth to Lily and Marcus for whatever years I have. I cannot give that away, not to anyone. He said, I know, Mom. I know. I said, but Thomas, I can help, in the ways that are within what I can give. I said, let Patricia and I look at the situation. Let me understand the actual numbers. Let me see what help looks like that does not require me to disappear my own security. He said, Mom, you do not have to. I said, Thomas, your father designed this trust because he understood that loving someone means planning for what they need, not just the good moments, the hard ones. He planned for this, for the moment when you needed something and I needed to be protected while giving it. I said both things can be true at the same time. I can help you and I can protect myself. The trust was designed for exactly that. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Mom, Dad thought of everything." I said, "Yes, Thomas. He did. That is why I am still here, and why you are still in that house. And why Sunday afternoons with Lily and Marcus are still happening. Because a man sat at this kitchen table in 1998 and thought of everything. He said, I want to come see you this weekend, with the kids, if that is okay." I said, "Thomas, it is always okay. It has always been okay." He said, "And Renata?" I said, "Renata is welcome at this table. She was wrong about this morning. She knows she was wrong. She is going to have to live with that and work through it with you. But she is the mother of my grandchildren, and she is welcome at this table." He said, "Thank you, Mom." He said, "Mom." I said, "Yes, sweetheart." He said, "You are going to be all right." I looked at the kitchen. At the table, Edward and I had bought in 1991 for $240. At the folder on the table, at the November light through the window. I said, "Thomas, your father told me that." He said, "I know." "I am telling you too." I said, "I know you are, sweetheart." I said, "I will see you Sunday." What I want to say to every woman watching today is something Edward said to me when he finished the trust document in 1998 and came home on a Tuesday evening and sat at this table and said, "I am finished." I said, "Finished with what?" He said, "With making sure you are going to be all right." I said, "Edward, we are 46 years old." He said, "I know." He said, "I am not being morbid. I am being an engineer." He said, "An engineer does not build a bridge and hope it holds. An engineer builds a bridge to hold." He designs for the load. He accounts for the stress. He makes sure that what he builds is strong enough for everything that is going to be applied to it. And then he goes home and has dinner and does not worry about the bridge because the bridge is designed. He said, "Ruth, I designed the bridge." I said, "Edward, I love you." He said, "I know." He said, "Eat your dinner." I ate my dinner. 26 years later, the load came. A woman with folded hands and carefully chosen language, and a plan built around a mother's love for her grandchildren. The bridge held. Because Edward designed it. Because some men love their wives not just in the good moments, but in the future moments. The hard ones, the ones they will not be present for. They design for those moments the way an engineer designs for a load, with precision, with care. With the particular love that plans for your protection before you know you need protecting. If you are watching today and you are a woman whose husband or whose father or whose family has left you with documents you have not fully read, open them, read them, call your attorney, understand what protection has been built for you. Because the people who loved you may have been planning for this moment long before this moment arrived. And if you are watching today and someone has come to your table with a plan designed to use your love for your family as a lever against your security, pull out the folder, because the bridge was designed, and the bridge holds. Tell me in the comments, has someone ever tried to use your love for your grandchildren or your children against you? Has someone ever wrapped a threat in the language of care? Has someone ever looked at you and thought they saw someone manageable? Tell me what you held on to. Because I think there are women watching today who are sitting across from someone with carefully chosen words and a plan, and who do not yet know that the protection was built for them years ago by someone who loved them enough to think that far ahead. Find the document. It is in the drawer. It has been waiting for you.